Welcome to the deep dive. We are jumping straight into a stack of source material today that is honestly going to challenge some pretty deeply held assumptions.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenging one.
Right. We are unpacking a very specific, highly provocative document. It's titled Iran's Victory, Anti-West Perspective.
And it is a dense, systematic deconstruction of, well, the idea that Western dominance is just this permanent fixture of the global order.
Which brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. We're going to explore the tactical, the economic, and the psychological arguments presented by this author.
Arguments claiming the American empire is basically structurally destined to lose a conflict against Iran.
Exactly. But before we get into the weeds here, I need to speak directly to you, the listener, for a second.
Right, the disclaimer is crucial here.
It really is. Look, we all know the source material contains highly politically charged content, so I want to make it explicitly clear right up front. Neither of us here is taking sides today.
Absolutely not.
We are not endorsing these anti-Western viewpoints. We aren't validating the geopolitical claims made in this text. Our mission is purely analytical.
We're just the messengers.
Right. We are here to impartially report on and unpack these fascinating, albeit very controversial, arguments. We want you to understand the architecture of this specific perspective.
And what's fascinating here is that the whole foundation of this perspective rests on dismantling a very specific Western assumption.
The tech assumption.
Exactly. The entrenched belief that superior technology automatically guarantees a military victory. The text focuses heavily on asymmetric warfare and economic leverage.
And how those things can just completely neutralize technological dominance.
Right.
Which brings us to my favorite part of this document. I mean, what if I told you the most powerful military force in human history has actually already been defeated by Iran in a simulation?
And that the Pentagon essentially had to cheat to hide the results.
It reads like a movie script. Okay, let's unpack this. The year was 2002. The U.S. military ran this massive war game called Millennium Challenge.
A $250 million war game.
$250 million. The stated goal was to test future military concepts. The blue force was the United States.
And the red force was a Persian Gulf power that everyone in the room understood was standing in for Iran.
Right. And the red force was commanded by this retired Marine Corps Lieutenant General Paul Van Riper.
Who was essentially given a suicide mission.
Totally.
I mean, the blue force had everything. The satellite networks, the advanced sensors, overwhelming firepower. They issued this ultimatum demanding total surrender, expecting Van Riper to just, sit back and take it.
Just play the victim while they systematically dismantle him.
Right, but he refused to play along.
He launched this massive preemptive strike that completely overwhelmed the most advanced electronic sensors on the planet. The stats in this document are just staggering.
19 ships.
19 U.S. ships sunk in less than 10 minutes. That included an aircraft carrier, 10 cruisers, and 5 amphibious ships.
And over 20,000 simulated casualties.
In 10 minutes. So how does a significantly weaker force pull off one of the biggest upsets in military history against this trillion-dollar tech juggernaut?
By weaponizing the Goliath's reliance on its own technology. Van Riper knew the U.S. military was completely dependent on digital networks.
They're listening to every radio frequency, watching every screen.
Right. So he just went analog. He stepped entirely outside the digital arena. He used motorcycle messengers to physically carry written orders between his commanders.
Bypassing all the NSA-level eavesdropping.
Completely. And to launch his planes without using vulnerable radios, he had his forces use old-fashioned light signals right from the runways.
$250 million on a digital simulation, and they get wiped out by guys on motorcycles with paper in their pockets.
That's the core takeaway here. Van Riper proved that a thinking, adaptive enemy can blind a technologically superior force just by refusing to fight on their terms.
But the author argues the real story is how the military responded to this embarrassment.
The institutional denial.
Right. The defeat was so catastrophic they literally hit the reset button.
They refloated the sunken ships.
This magical response.
Pretty much. And then they forced Van Riper to follow this strict, highly constrained script for the rest of the exercise so the Blue Force could get their textbook win.
Which the text argues just taught the Pentagon how to lie to itself instead of learning how to fight a real adaptable enemy.
And the document actually draws a direct historical line from that hubris to real-world events, specifically the 1980 Operation Eagle Claw.
The botched hostage rescue mission in the desert under Carter?
Exactly, where highly specialized helicopters failed because of severe dust storms. The text quotes Ayatollah Khomeini, who said after the failure, who crushed Mr. Carter's helicopters. The Sands did. They were God's agents.
Which, sounds like pure mysticism at first glance.
It does, but this author frames it as a profound recognition of environmental and asymmetric limits on mechanical power.
A refusal to succumb to Western military logic.
Right.
So, if traditional military dominance is neutralized, like in the simulation, the battlefield has to shift. And the text argues Iran doesn't even need to fire a shot to trigger a global crisis.
They just need to look at a map.
Exactly. Why should you, listening to this right now, care about a waterway thousands of miles away? Because it affects literally everything you buy.
The Strait of Hormuz.
It's always been a geopolitical flashpoint, but this perspective frames it as an economic guillotine hanging over the West. Let's talk about the geography.
The geography itself is the weapon. The strait is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. But the actual shipping lanes that are deep enough for massive oil tankers,
They're tiny.
just 2 miles wide in each direction.
2 miles.
And the document lays out this terrifying math. 20 to 25% of the global oil and gas supply travels through that tiny gap.
We are looking at over $1.3 billion worth of energy moving through there every single day.
The vulnerability levels are extreme. Take India. The text notes India relies on this route for 80 to 85% of their liquefied petroleum gas.
And LPG isn't just for cars there. It's the primary cooking and heating fuel for hundreds of millions of people.
Cut that off, and you have an instant humanitarian catastrophe. Japan and South Korea are at critical risk, too.
The text even suggests the EU would face a crisis easily rivaling the massive energy shocks we saw back in 2022.
Easily.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Iran doesn't need to win a naval war. They don't need to sink the U.S. Navy.
They just need to stop the flow of oil for 30 days.
30 days.
Because a 30-day blockade isn't just a supply chain hiccup. The source predicts it would trigger a systemic heart attack for an already debt-burdened American economy.
Oil skyrocketing to $140 a barrel.
Or even blowing past $200.
Which makes the price of everything, manufacturing, groceries, transport, just go completely parabolic.
Right. The text quotes Colonel Douglas Macgregor here, warning that the current posture is already an emergency. He notes that static American bases in the region are highly vulnerable and could be rendered unusable almost immediately.
So the author's conclusion is blunt. When the oil stops, the Western world stops.
It's a sobering claim.
It is. Which naturally brings up the biggest question. Why would the U.S. risk such massive economic ruin? Why risk systemic collapse?
And that leads us to the geopolitical argument of the text.
Yes. And I want to remind you again, we are now exploring the author's highly sensitive claims about why the U.S. operates this way. We are analyzing the text, not endorsing the politics.
Right. So the framework the author uses here relies heavily on the arguments of political scientists John Mearsheimer and Stephen Wald.
From their book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy.
Yes. And it's important to define what they mean by the lobby. They aren't talking about a single, shadowy organization.
Not a conspiracy.
No. They define it as a loose coalition of individuals, think tanks, and political action committees steering U.S. policy in a pro-Israel direction.
And the core claim this source makes is that the American public has been convinced that U.S. and Israeli interests are perfectly identical.
When the author argues they are actually diametrically opposed.
Right. The claim is that this dynamic drags the United States into quote-unquote forever wars that offer zero strategic benefit to the American mainland.
The text points to stark double standards to illustrate this. The big one is nuclear deterrence.
The U.S. aggressively pressures nations to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty,
using crippling sanctions to enforce it. Yet simultaneously, the document points out, the U.S. subsidizes Israel's open-secret, clandestine nuclear arsenal.
The author claims this strips the U.S. of its moral authority, and it creates massive blowback. They bring in Scott Ritter for this point.
The former UN weapons inspector.
Yeah, Ritter notes that Mossad operations, like allegedly working with the Azeri population to destabilize Iran, often blow back directly on American security.
The U.S. inherits the enemies of its allies. The text frames this as Washington sacrificing its own moral authority and economic security for a colonial project.
Okay, let's pivot from the geopolitics to the psychology of the Iranian people. Because the text argues the West has a fundamentally flawed assumption here.
The assumption that economic sanctions and internal repression will inevitably cause the Iranian regime to collapse from the inside.
Exactly. Squeeze them hard enough and they'll revolt.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, The source claims the exact opposite is happening. They call it mobilized resilience.
And they back it up with sociological data.
Right. The data shows that national crises in Iran historically strengthen social
They
bonds.
don't fracture, they pull together. Neighbors start sharing hoarded supplies.
Local mosques transform from just places of worship into these highly organized, emotional, and logistical recovery centers.
There's a really specific data point here about 2,600 Iranian psychologists who signed a public pledge of national unity.
Showing how deep this resistance mindset goes. The author actually contrasts this with Gaza, claiming Gaza has predictably higher rates of clinical hopelessness due to being besieged.
Whereas Iran supposedly benefits from having the fully functioning infrastructure of a massive sovereign state.
Combined with a deeply ingrained religious narrative they call sacred resistance.
Which transforms feelings of helplessness into mobilized action.
And it's a top-down adaptation, too. When sanctions hit, the Iranian elites didn't just panic. They launched campaigns promoting capital-labor unity.
Integrating Islamic economic principles of social justice.
Right, trying to cushion the blow for the poorest citizens. The author's thesis is that the Iranian people aren't just surviving the pressure, they are adapting to it.
Making sanctions completely useless for regime change. Which brings us back to the physical battlefield. Let's talk about the math of attrition in deep tech.
The tactical trap.
Right. The U.S. plans for a quick decapitation strike, shock and awe. But Iran has been preparing for a grinding war of attrition.
And the cost asymmetry here is just staggering. Take the Iranian Shahed 136 drones.
They cost, what, a few $1,000s to make?
A few $1,000s. But to shoot them down, the U.S. relies on systems like the Patriot PASI-3 interceptors.
Which cost millions of dollars per shot.
Exactly. The text notes the economic ratio is 1 to 150 in favor of Iran.
Wow.
The defense literally destroys the wealth of the attacker. You spend $4 million to destroy $20,000.
Do that a few thousand times and you bankrupt the defending military. It's wild. But it's not all low-tech, cheap drones, right? They also have offensive high-tech capabilities.
Oh, absolutely. The source details their hypersonic Fatah missiles.
Traveling at Mach 15.
Mach 15. The claim here is that speeds like that render current Western interceptor technology completely obsolete.
The radars can't even blink fast enough.
No. But the most daunting tactical reality is what the text calls the phantom in the mountains, the missile cities.
Because Iran knows they can't match U.S. air power, so they went underground.
Deep underground. Iran's main nuclear installations and 15 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps divisions are buried in these complex mountain bases.
Like the Lara complex.
Right. They are so deep that Western GBU-57 bunker buster bombs supposedly cannot reach them.
And those bombs weigh 30,000 pounds.
It doesn't matter. You can't destroy a military complex if your weapons physically cannot reach it.
So what does this all mean? Let's synthesize this deep dive. The author builds a four-pillar argument for why an Iranian victory is inevitable.
Right.
First, the tactical blindness of the West, relying on tech over asymmetric strategy. Second, the Hormuz economic trigger.
Closing a 21-mile strait to collapse the global economy.
Third, the psychological resilience of the Iranian people under sanctions. And fourth, the geopolitical liability of U.S. alliances.
And we have to point out the crucial warning the text ends with, the threat of a power vacuum.
Right, because even if the U.S. collapsed the regime,
In a country of 90 million people, mind you,
it wouldn't result in a pro-Western democracy.
the author says it would create a chaotic, 30 years war-esque nightmare dystopia.
It would destabilize the entire planet.
The cure would be infinitely worse than the disease.
Which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought to mull over. And I want you, the listener, to think about this. The source material quotes Amos Yadlin.
The former head of Israel's military intelligence.
Right. He warns that in modern warfare, the idea of absolute victory is a myth.
It doesn't exist anymore.
Think about it. If a trillion-dollar high-tech military can be neutralized by cheap drones, underground tunnels, and economic choke points, is the era of the traditional superpower fundamentally over?
It really makes you question what winning even looks like in the 21st century.
It really does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a highly complex, deeply challenging perspective. We hope it gave you a new lens to view these global dynamics. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.